Rhode Island, summer 1942. The air along Narragansett Bay trembled with the rhythm of hammers and the roar of machinery. At Quonset Point Naval Air Station, smoke curled above half-finished frames of curved steel, rows upon rows of semicircular huts rising like a metallic tide. Sparks burst from welders' torches, showering the ground in light. Seagulls scattered over the bay as trucks rumbled in, hauling corrugated steel panels stacked higher than the men guiding them. To one side, a group of visiting engineers, captured Germans under American guard, watched silently. They had once built bunkers from concrete and fear. What they saw here defied the laws of time and labor. In their homeland, construction meant months. In America, buildings seemed to grow overnight. Each arch fit perfectly into the next, every bolt in place, every motion rehearsed. There was no wasted gesture, only relentless precision. The name Quonset Hut would soon circle the globe, stamped into military supply logs from Africa to the Aleutians. And for German engineers, this site marked the moment they realized America had weaponized efficiency itself. By mid-1942, the Allied world faced a problem no amount of courage could solve: where to put millions of men. Every new campaign demanded instant towns, barracks, hospitals, depots, mess halls, command posts. The Pacific was a map of empty islands. North Africa was scorched sand. Britain's southern coast was crowded beyond endurance. Conventional construction was too slow. The United States, suddenly fighting on two oceans, needed buildings that could be packed in crates, shipped anywhere, and raised by untrained hands. The solution emerged at Quonset Point, Rhode Island in the spring of 1941, months before Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks commissioned a small group of engineers from George A. Fuller Company and Steel Structures, Inc. to design a structure that met three unyielding rules. It had to be light, strong, and fast. Their answer was elegant in its simplicity: a half-cylinder of corrugated steel bolted to a plywood deck, its curve giving strength without the need for internal columns. 2 men could lift a panel. 50 could raise a village. When war exploded in December 1941, the prototype was already proven. Within weeks, the Navy ordered thousands. The modest design office at Quonset Point became a roaring industrial zone where assembly line logic replaced carpenters' benches. Every step, cutting, drilling, riveting, sawing, was standardized, measured in seconds, not hours. The hut's genius lay not in its materials, but in its method. It could be built like a machine, not like a house. Across America, idle factories joined the effort. Great Lakes Steel, Strand Steel, and Atlas Powder converted peacetime production lines to roll out curved sheets and pre-punched frames. Rail cars left Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh loaded with kits of identical parts: steel ribs, wooden floors, bolts, nails, paint. Each kit built one hut, 960 square feet of shelter, and weighed just under 10 tons. They could be stacked on Liberty ships and reassembled at the front within a single day. The scale was staggering. In 1942 alone, the Navy demanded 27,000 huts. By 1943, the War Department asked for double. The design evolved. The original 16 by 36-foot frame grew into larger, redesigned Quonsets, some stretching 40 feet wide. Windows, insulation, and flooring were added for climates from Alaska to Guadalcanal. Each modification was fed back into production within weeks, not months, a rhythm of constant improvement that bewildered visiting British and Canadian officers accustomed to slower bureaucracies. Behind every rivet stood workers who had never worn a uniform: housewives from Providence, machinists from Worcester, high school graduates learning to weld on the job. Their shift whistles marked the tempo of America's industrial war. To them, every arc of steel meant soldiers housed, nurses sheltered, aircraft protected from monsoon rain. It was industrial empathy. Mass production turned to human need. While the huts rolled out by the thousands, German intelligence reports began to note a curious pattern. Aerial photos of Allied bases showed identical semicircular shapes multiplying along runways and docks. In occupied Europe, engineers speculated they were fuel tanks or hangars. Only later did they learn that these tin domes were dwellings, an entire architecture born from America's assembly lines. For a nation that had once struggled to build a single fortification before the Blitzkrieg, the sight of entire prefabricated towns was deeply unsettling. Every Quonset hut carried a silent message. America had solved the logistics of living. No mud, no tents, no wasted time. Steel and geometry had replaced improvisation. In a war measured in tons and hours, that mastery of shelter mattered as much as guns or planes. The German engineers who eventually saw Quonset Point understood that these arches of corrugated steel represented something larger than construction. They were proof that industrial imagination could be mobilized faster than an army. By the summer of 1943, orders surpassed 60,000 units. The Navy's construction battalions, the CBs, trained with the kits, rehearsing assembly in record time. A team of 10 men could raise a hut in under 6 hours. The design spread beyond the Navy to the Army, Air Forces, Marines, and even British Commonwealth forces. The huts appeared in every theater where Americans landed. They became the first sight of the United States on foreign soil, a shining arch of steel that said, "The Americans are here." The world was learning what mass production truly meant, and this was only the beginning of how Quonset Point would redefine wartime engineering. The Quonset Hut's rise coincided with the moment when the United States learned to think in systems instead of projects. Every rivet and bolt that left Rhode Island was tracked on punch cards. Logistics officers in Washington could read exactly which ship carried which kit, which island had which number of buildings. It was war as supply chain, and for the first time the battlefield began at the factory gate. The genius behind the design came from men who never fired a shot. Peter de Jong and Otto Brandenberger, civil engineers from the Fuller Company, studied the barrel vaults of Roman aqueducts and the temporary aircraft hangars of the First World War. Their insight was that curvature was strength, the same physics that made a bridge arch could shelter men from bombs and storms. The shape scattered blast pressure and shed snow or monsoon rain. It could be buried for protection or opened at both ends for ventilation. Nothing about it was decorative. Everything was functional. The Navy approved the prototype in record time. By the autumn of 1942, entire coastal warehouses were devoted to pre-packing thousands of identical kits. The process mirrored the automobile assembly lines that had once turned out Buicks and Fords. Conveyor belts carried steel ribs to hydraulic presses. Workers drilled holes exactly 9 inches apart, and inspectors checked each batch with gauges. Every mistake multiplied by thousands, so precision became doctrine. The motto printed on the factory wall read, "Fit the first, fit them all." Transportation posed its own challenges. America's rail network groaned under the weight of munitions and food convoys. To move the huts without delay, the War Production Board created a separate freight code giving Quonset shipments priority equal to aircraft engines. Liberty ships sailing from Norfolk or San Francisco carried hundreds of hut kits stacked like coins. In some ports, cranes worked around the clock under blackout to load them between tanks and ammunition crates. When the ships reached their destinations, CBs and engineers turned beaches into cities within days. The impact rippled far beyond logistics. For many soldiers arriving in a foreign land, the sight of a Quonset hut meant safety, a roof after weeks in the jungle or desert. The semicircle became an emotional landmark, a small piece of home curved against the horizon. Chapels, hospitals, and radio rooms all shared the same silhouette. Within weeks of the North African landings, Allied press officers were sending photographs of smiling troops standing in front of the shiny steel huts, proof to families that America could care for its own even thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, in occupied Europe, the German Construction Corps, the organization TOD, studied captured huts from North Africa. Their reports, preserved in post-war archives, described them with a mix of admiration and disbelief. German engineers noted that each American structure used 1/10 the labor hours of a comparable German barrack. They also observed that the curved roof required no heavy timber, a resource Germany was rapidly exhausting. One memo concluded bluntly, "The Americans build as if time itself were their ally." What astonished the analysts most was that the Americans had managed to standardize comfort. Huts shipped to the Aleutians arrived with insulation and double flooring. Those bound for the tropics carried screened vents and roll-up sides. Every kit was climate-coded and shipped with assembly manuals printed in waterproof ink. This flexibility and not size or cost was the real marvel. Where the Axis built fixed fortresses, the United States built mobility. By late 1943, the numbers dwarfed imagination. Production peaked at nearly 500 huts per day, supported by over 150 subcontractors across 30 states. The average cost per building had dropped from $2,000 to under $1,000. Allied commanders joked that for every German bunker destroyed, 10 Quonsets rose somewhere else. The design became so ubiquitous that Quonset entered soldiers' vocabulary as shorthand for any safe shelter. What began as an emergency Navy contract had turned into a symbol of industrial democracy, a building simple enough for anyone to erect, yet strong enough to withstand war. It blurred the line between engineering and logistics, between home and front. For German planners studying aerial photographs of Allied bases, those endless arcs of steel were more than shapes. They were proof of an enemy whose imagination could not be bombed into submission. The huts were about to leave the drawing board behind and prove their worth across 5 continents. And it was in that global rollout that German engineers would finally grasp the scale of America's industrial revolution in motion. When the Quonset Hut left Rhode Island's assembly lines, it became more than a product. It became a statement of industrial democracy in motion. At the heart of this transformation stood a new kind of soldier, the Seabee, half builder, half combatant, whose weapon was a wrench and whose battlefield was mud. Across the Pacific, Seabees trained to unload crates by the hundreds, sort numbered panels, and raise entire compounds under enemy observation. Their manual began with one sentence: "Every hour saved in building is an hour gained in fighting." They learned to drive stakes through coral, anchor frames in volcanic ash, and line roofs with sandbags against strafing. Within days of landing on Guadalcanal, they had huts for surgery, radio control, and sleeping quarters. Officers remembered that when food and ammunition were still uncertain, the huts went up first. Shelter was morale. On the home front, another army labored in silence. Women welders in Detroit and Chicago rolled steel arches by the thousands, their faces lit by the glow of torches. Teenagers sanded plywood floors in makeshift workshops. In war bond posters, the smooth curve of a Quonset hut appeared behind smiling workers, captioned, "Built by hands that never leave the front." The line blurred between civilian and soldier. Both were part of the same chain of creation. In places as far apart as Iceland and New Guinea, the huts took on local color. Some were painted desert tan, others jungle green. In Alaska, they were coated in silver to reflect the brief Arctic sun. A hut could become a chapel, a laboratory, even a movie theater. Soldiers etched names on their walls: Boston, Brooklyn, Kansas, until the inside felt like an improvised neighborhood. War photographers captured these curved silhouettes against alien landscapes, proof that the American presence was permanent, organized, and humane. For the troops, the Quonset was comfort engineered. Its semicircular frame muffled wind. Its wooden floors stayed dry when the ground turned to sludge. Inside, a potbelly stove glowed. Radios crackled Glenn Miller tunes. And for a few hours each night, the world shrank to a warm pool of light. Veterans later said that stepping into one after a patrol felt like crossing from chaos into order, the industrial rhythm of home humming through steel ribs. Logistically, the huts became a miracle of predictability. A quartermaster in New Caledonia could telegraph for 20 huts, and within days a freighter unloaded numbered crates, each bolt and beam accounted for. This reliability, down to the last screw, was what military planners called the American advantage. Where the enemy relied on improvisation, the United States relied on replication. Every hut stood exactly like the next. Familiarity bred efficiency, and efficiency bred momentum. Even the way they fell into battle had a certain poetry. In Normandy, bulldozers cleared fields behind the invasion lines, and within hours, curved roofs dotted the French countryside. Local farmers watched with disbelief as entire towns appeared from cargo ships. "They build like they breathe," one French observer wrote. To the Germans retreating through hedgerows, those arches gleaming under the gray sky were symbols of an enemy whose capacity seemed infinite. Within American command circles, the Quonset became shorthand for progress. Generals measured logistics in huts per week. At naval bases, officers lived in rows of them. At forward hospitals, nurses treated the wounded under their tin ceilings. The huts blurred into the landscape of victory until they were as recognizable as the Jeep or the Sherman tank. Behind their simplicity lay a profound truth about 20th century warfare. The battle was no longer won only by tactics, but by production. Every soldier who stepped into a Quonset hut felt the invisible hand of a nation that could turn ideas into objects faster than any adversary. That realization spread through the ranks as morale. For the Americans, it was reassurance. For the Germans, a warning whispered through intelligence briefings. The enemy manufactures shelter faster than we can destroy it. As 1943 turned to 1944, the Quonset Hut ceased to be an experiment. It became a global signature of American presence, rising on every shore touched by Allied boots. Yet beyond its human comfort and speed lay deeper consequences, technological, psychological, and even cultural, that reshaped how both sides thought about war itself. Those angles, the science, the enemy perspective, and the quiet moral symbolism of mass-produced shelter, would reveal why German engineers, when they finally confronted the scale of this creation, were left speechless. On the technical side, the Quonset Hut embodied everything the German engineering culture admired, and everything it had failed to achieve. In the Reich, factories still built to bespoke designs. Draftsmen measured by millimeter and hand-cut every component. In America, the logic of Fordism had conquered construction. The Quonset's curved ribs came off rollers like rifle cartridges, each identical, each marked with a number that told a soldier exactly where it fit. Assembly required no architect, only a manual and discipline. When Axis intelligence analysts dissected a captured set in North Africa, they were astonished to find the instructions printed in 8 languages and illustrated so clearly that even a conscript could follow them. To German eyes, that was the triumph of standardization over craftsmanship. Technologically, the hut was a study in efficiency. The use of corrugated galvanized steel exploited tensile strength through shape rather than mass. The curvature carried snow loads and blast pressure evenly, so that thin sheets performed like armor. The end walls could be plywood, masonite, or even canvas, depending on climate, allowing material substitution without redesign. Bolts and washers were standardized across all models, matching hardware used in jeeps and landing craft. The same spanner could repair a truck or raise a roof. This interchangeability, trivial on paper, made supply officers smile. It meant fewer spare parts, fewer delays, more huts. For the engineers studying captured examples after the war, the real revelation was the production method itself. In Germany, every structural innovation competed for scarce resources and political favor. In the United States, the War Production Board coordinated steel, lumber, and transport through a single integrated plan. The hut's entire supply chain functioned like a single machine. Ore mined in Minnesota, rolled in Michigan, punched in Pennsylvania, assembled in Rhode Island, shipped from New York. No step waited for the next. Everything moved simultaneously. German observers later called it horizontal mobilization, an approach they could scarcely replicate under bombing and shortage. Yet the Quonset story had a quieter angle too, its moral geometry. Where the Axis built fortifications to dominate, the Americans built shelters to sustain. The same industrial genius that produced bombers also produced homes for refugees, classrooms for Allied children, and field hospitals with white-painted walls. In Italy and France, liberated civilians watched Seabees hammer these curved shells into towns and understood that American power carried more than steel. It carried intention. Photos of smiling nurses outside Quonset wards ran in newspapers across Europe, contrasting sharply with ruins left by retreating armies. Even propaganda could not disguise the moral dimension of industrial organization serving life rather than conquest. Culturally, the huts became ambassadors of a new aesthetic. Architects visiting forward bases saw in them the seed of post-war modernism, form born of function, economy turned to elegance. Some later adapted the design for peacetime housing in schools. The German prisoners who worked alongside American engineers in reconstruction camps took sketches home. A few prototypes appeared in 1950s Europe under different names, silent heirs to a wartime revelation. Within the U.S. military itself, the Quonset altered thinking about logistics. Commanders realized that mobility depended as much on roofs as on fuel. The ability to create instant infrastructure, storage, repair shops, mess halls, gave Allied forces a rhythm that the Axis never matched. At the height of production, one Navy report boasted that the sun never sets on a Quonset hut. It was not a boast of empire but of reach, a recognition that supply had become strategy. When captured German engineers toured American bases after the surrender, they stopped in front of rows of huts still standing 3 years after erection, paint flaking, but structures solid. One remarked, half admiring, half resigned, "You fought us with factories." He was not wrong. The war had been a contest between precision and scale had won. Through these lenses, the mechanical, the organizational, the moral, the humble hut revealed the full dimension of America's industrial will. Its curve framed the story of a nation that could turn geometry into logistics and compassion into steel. And for those who once believed efficiency was theirs alone, that realization was the sharpest defeat of all. The stage was now set for the decisive moment when the Quonset Hut left the realm of concept and entered legend, its global deployment transforming battlefronts and minds alike. By late 1943, the Quonset Hut stopped being an American convenience and became an Allied constant. The blueprint that had begun as a naval sketch now sheltered soldiers from Tunisia to the Solomon Islands. In every theater, the same ritual unfolded: the rumble of cargo doors, the clang of crates hitting the sand, then the rhythm of bolts meeting steel. Out of nothing, a base appeared. At the port of Oran, North Africa, convoys disgorged hut kits by the thousand. In 48 hours, the docks held neat rows of silver shells gleaming in the desert light. The French dock workers who helped unload them stared in disbelief. A city had risen where the tide met the dunes. Each building served a purpose: field kitchens, maintenance shops, chapels. Yet every arch shared the same geometry. American correspondents wrote that the curve of the Quonset now marks the frontier of progress. To Axis observers peering through binoculars, those curves marked something else: inevitability. The true test came across the Pacific. At Guadalcanal, where rain fell like poured iron and humidity rotted timber in days, the huts proved indestructible. Seabees drove steel ribs into coral, bolted panels under lightning flashes, and slept beneath them that same night. When typhoons ripped through camps, canvas tents vanished, but the hut stayed, dented, soaked, still standing. Reports cabled to Washington read like battlefield commendations. Structure survived Category 3 winds. Minimal damage. The Navy realized it had created not just shelter but infrastructure, a weapon against chaos. From the Aleutians to Bougainville, identical stories spread. In the Aleutians, men wrapped the huts in tar paper and snowbank insulation. In Burma, they lined them with bamboo mats. Every adaptation reinforced the design's genius. Simplicity breeds survival. By mid-1944, more than 120 manufacturers fed the supply chain, and weekly output surpassed 10 million square feet of usable floor space. The scale defied even America's own engineers. Factories worked around the clock, guided by blueprints that fit on a single sheet. To the Germans studying captured examples in Europe, the site became an obsession. Reconnaissance flights over British ports showed concentric rings of huts spreading like ripples. A Luftwaffe analyst annotated one photograph with disbelief. Each shape repeats without deviation. How can fabrication be so uniform? The answer lay in the philosophy they had dismissed: mass production as culture. While Germany invested in precision craftsmanship, America had turned uniformity into art. The psychological impact was enormous. German prisoners captured in Italy described being marched through Allied supply zones that stretched for miles, rows of Quonsets glinting under the sun, each one stocked and numbered. One prisoner later told an interrogator, "If they can build this much shelter, they can build anything." It was not propaganda. It was realization. Strategically, the huts changed operational tempo. In earlier wars, advancing armies paused weeks to construct quarters and depots. Now the U.S. forces paused hours. Engineers could blueprint a base on paper during transit, unload, and assemble within a day. Airfields followed, maintenance crews followed, then aircraft. The curve of steel shortened the distance between arrival and action. Commanders called it the Quonset advantage. At Normandy, the pattern repeated. Within a week of the landings, Quonsets stretched across the French coast, housing everything from radio operators to bakeries. Locals nicknamed them Maisons Américaines, and children drew them in notebooks as the shape of liberation. Even when shellfire shattered nearby towns, the huts endured. A U.S. Army engineer noted that fragments often ricocheted off the curved roofs instead of piercing them. A physics lesson turned lifesaver. Back in Berlin's war ministries, reports of these portable fortresses reached senior planners. Some dismissed them as mere propaganda. Others saw deeper meaning. A memorandum found after the war summarized their anxiety. The Americans industrialize even the air they breathe. Where we build monuments, they build tools. By autumn 1944, as Allied forces advanced through France and across the Pacific, the Quonset Hut had become omnipresent, an architectural flag planted wherever the United States arrived. To German engineers inspecting abandoned airfields, the realization was final. America's strength was not only in tonnage or weapons, but in the ability to manufacture permanence overnight. Each hut was a silent equation of labor and logistics, a curved testament that speed could be strategic. The world's first truly global building had proven its worth under fire. And in the months ahead, as the Allies crossed the Rhine and the Pacific closed in on Japan, the reaction from captured German engineers would shift from curiosity to open awe. In early 1945, as the Allied advance gained momentum, the Quonset Hut became a silent witness to the final unraveling of the Axis. It appeared in photographs of every campaign, its curved ribs reflecting the sunlight behind advancing columns of Sherman tanks and C-47 transports. To the public, it was background. To the enemy, it was evidence that America's production never slept. Captured German engineers who were transferred to Allied depots in France and later to internment camps in the United States finally saw the phenomenon up close. At Camp Shanks, New York, the embarkation point for over 1 million soldiers, they walked past hundreds of huts arranged with mathematical precision. Kitchens, dormitories, libraries, even chapels, each one identical, each one spotless. For men who had spent years improvising under shortages, the sight was crushing. They were used to rebuilding ruins. The Americans seemed to manufacture order itself. The interrogations that followed often drifted away from weapons or tactics and toward production methods. "How do you build them so quickly?" one German structural officer reportedly asked his counterpart. The American smiled and replied, "We don't build. We assemble." That distinction between craftsmanship and process summed up the transformation the world was witnessing. War was no longer the triumph of the best engineer. It was the triumph of the fastest system. Even the Soviet observers attached to Allied command noted it. Reports from the Red Army's liaison mission in London described the Quonset as a building without ideology, pure utility. Yet that utility carried its own message. Wherever the Americans went, they created shelter not only for their troops but for civilians left homeless by the retreating Axis. In liberated France, nurses operated from Quonset hospitals. In Italy, school children attended class inside their curved walls. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on technical superiority, watched as their own prisoners were housed humanely under American steel arches, fed regularly and treated with medical care inside structures produced by the thousand. The moral weight of that contrast was heavier than any bombardment. By the spring of 1945, production records listed more than 150,000 Quonset huts shipped worldwide. They formed the skeleton of entire bases, naval yards in the Pacific, bomber fields in England, forward logistics hubs on Okinawa. Each base could be dismantled and rebuilt elsewhere, an organism that adapted as the front moved. The design's flexibility allowed the U.S. to outpace even its own plans. New airstrips appeared weeks ahead of schedule because the huts that supported them were already en route. In this way, industrial architecture had become a weapon of tempo. When Germany finally surrendered, Allied intelligence invited selected German engineers to tour captured American installations in France and Belgium. They were encouraged to study, to learn, even to critique. At one such site near Cherbourg, a Luftwaffe construction officer examined a line of weathered huts still in daily use after 2 brutal winters. Running his hand along the corrugated steel, he murmured, "It's not the metal, it's the method." He meant that the true innovation lay not in the materials but in the orchestration that produced them. In the months that followed, many of those same engineers were quietly employed under Allied supervision to help rebuild Europe. Ironically, they found themselves designing temporary housing, Quonset derivatives for displaced civilians. The curve that had once signified American power now became a symbol of reconstruction. Children played in the shadow of the same arches their fathers had once feared. Inside the U.S. now, demobilization turned the huts into a domestic miracle. College campuses converted them into dormitories. Towns used them as post offices and stores. Victory homes, newspapers called them. What had begun as a naval expedient ended as a civic institution. To observers abroad, it confirmed the suspicion that America's strength was not a wartime anomaly, but a permanent condition. A culture that could convert wartime industry into peacetime prosperity overnight. For the German engineers who had witnessed it all, the memory lingered. In post-war interrogations, several admitted that the Huts had shaken their faith in Germany's industrial invincibility more than any bombing raid. "They built the world while we were destroying ours," one said. His words, simple and resigned, captured the essence of the turning point. The Quonset Hut was never just steel and bolts. It was the physical manifestation of an idea that progress could be prefabricated, exported, and multiplied beyond resistance. As 1945 drew to a close, the curved silhouette of the Quonset remained against every horizon the United States had touched. It stood as proof that ingenuity, when industrialized, could be as decisive as any weapon on the battlefield. And in that realization, the stunned German engineers saw the future. Wars would be won not only by armies but by the architecture of speed. The war's end did not bring silence to Quonset Point. Even as victory parades filled American streets, the factories still rang with the hiss of steam and the clang of presses. Contracts were canceled, but the machines kept working, turning military kits into civilian hope. When Germany surrendered in May 1945 and Japan followed in August, the United States found itself surrounded by mountains of material. Tanks, planes, and over 150,000 prefabricated huts. Most nations saw surplus as waste. America saw opportunity. Across Europe and Asia, tens of millions were homeless. Cities lay in ruins from Hamburg to Hiroshima. In this devastation, the Quonset Hut, designed for battlefronts, became the architecture of peace. The U.S. Navy donated thousands to the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Within months, the same structures that had sheltered soldiers now sheltered refugees. Photographs from 1946 show camps in Italy, Greece, and the Philippines. Rows of curved roofs rising among shattered brick walls. In Tokyo, American engineers worked alongside Japanese carpenters to adapt the huts as temporary schools. The irony was profound. Steel born from war now forged education. On American soil, the transformation was just as swift. Returning veterans flooded universities under the GI Bill, and there were not enough dormitories to house them. The answer arrived on flatbed trucks. Campuses from California to New England ordered surplus huts by the dozen. Students painted them in bright colors, planted flowers outside, and called them Quonset villages. For a generation that had grown up amid uncertainty, those curved roofs represented stability. Beneath them, the post-war middle class began its first lessons. In rural America, towns converted huts into everything imaginable. Post offices, churches, diners, roller rinks, and community theaters. The flexible design, which had once adapted to deserts and jungles, now adapted to peacetime life. For many, the Quonset became a symbol of thrift and practicality, an emblem of how Americans could turn military necessity into civic creativity. Even Hollywood took notice. The huts appeared in newsreels and films as shorthand for resilience, always gleaming with a certain democratic modesty. Meanwhile, in Europe, reconstruction planners studied them as a model for temporary infrastructure. British architects used surplus kits to rebuild bombed neighborhoods in London. French engineers redesigned them with brick end walls and called them baraquements américains. In Norway, the government imported hundreds to house fishermen and their families displaced by German occupation. The curved silhouette spread quietly across the world, outliving the ruins it once replaced. For German engineers repatriated under Allied supervision, the lesson endured long after surrender. Many were astonished to see the same huts reappear in civilian relief. In technical journals of the late 1940s, articles analyzed the Quonset's economy of form and its contribution to mass housing theory. It had become, unexpectedly, a case study in ethical engineering, proof that industrial efficiency could serve humanity as well as warfare. Economically, the hut also marked a transition point for the United States itself. The wartime coordination that had produced it evolved into peacetime industry. Companies that once riveted steel panels now manufactured washing machines and automobiles using the same supply chains. The mindset that had built 100,000 huts in months now built suburbs in years. In that sense, every post-war American home carried a fragment of Quonset DNA. Prefabricated materials, modular designs, standardized fittings. The line between military logistics and domestic life had vanished. Yet for all its utility, the Quonset retained a quiet dignity. Its shape never changed, its simplicity never needed ornament. On storm-battered islands and city streets alike, it remained a curve of strength, its story etched into both victory and recovery. What had once symbolized wartime speed now embodied post-war endurance. By the end of the decade, the huts began to rust and fade, replaced by permanent structures, but their legacy lingered in memory and method, the idea that architecture could be mass-produced without losing humanity. And for those who had first seen them rise in the chaos of war, that idea would forever define America's new kind of power. Not destruction, but design. By 1948, the Quonset Hut had become a global footprint of the war's end. In the ruins of Europe, it stood beside cathedrals and crumbled factories. In the islands of the Pacific, it stood where jungles had been burned to ash. Its design had outlasted battlefields, borders, and ideologies. Wherever it appeared, it carried with it the unmistakable message of American organization, an order that could rebuild as swiftly as it once conquered. When former Axis nations began their own reconstruction, many quietly borrowed from the concept. In Japan, architects at Tokyo University studied the Quonset's modular rib system for post-war housing. Their reports concluded that no single form better expresses the transformation from scarcity to sufficiency. In Germany, the same engineers who had once studied captured huts under military orders now used the method to build schools, warehouses, and train depots. It was the most unexpected kind of reparation, intellectual, not material. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers retained the design for Cold War contingencies. Modified versions nicknamed Jamesway and Butler huts and appeared in Korea, Greenland, and even Antarctica. When the United States established its first research base on the polar ice in 1957, the curved outline of the Quonset once again stood against wind and time. The hut that had been born at sea level in Rhode Island now sheltered scientists at the end of the earth. Economists later pointed out that its influence extended beyond architecture. The process that created the Quonset, the assembly line philosophy applied to construction, became a blueprint for post-war industrial growth. Prefabricated houses, mobile classrooms, and modular offices all traced their lineage to those wartime arcs of steel. Even the language of business adopted the same rhythm: streamline, assemble, replicate. The line between invention and production blurred forever. Yet beneath those economic triumphs lay a quieter human legacy. For millions of soldiers, the site of a Quonset hut was the site of home. Temporary, yes, but dependable. Veterans recalled the smell of rain drumming on corrugated steel, the echo of voices under the arch, the way the curved roof made sound travel like memory. Decades later, many sought out surviving huts, buying and restoring them as workshops or retreats. It kept us alive, one Pacific veteran told a reporter in 1972. I figured it deserved to keep living too. In time, the Quonset's shape entered the cultural imagination. Artists painted it, photographers framed it against sunsets. Novelists used it as a symbol of transition, the bridge between the chaos of war and the calm of reconstruction. Historians debated its meaning. Was it the architecture of empire or of democracy? Most agreed it was both, the visible curve of a nation learning how to build peace as methodically as it had built war. For German engineers who had once been stunned by its scale, the memory carried a paradoxical respect. In post-war memoirs, some wrote that the huts had taught them the true measure of American power, not arrogance, but pragmatism. Not decoration, but discipline. One former Luftwaffe technician, reflecting on his time as a POW, wrote, "Their buildings looked temporary, yet their idea of progress was permanent." It was a verdict no general could have delivered better. As the 20th century advanced, many of the original huts rusted away, reclaimed by vines or repurposed into barns and garages. But their essence endured wherever speed met necessity. In disaster zones, refugee camps, and temporary missions, engineers still borrowed their logic: lightweight, repeatable, strong. The curve remained immortal, not because of metal, but because of what it symbolized: a civilization that had learned to solve problems with design instead of domination. By the time the last Quonset factory closed in the 1970s, more than 500,000 had been produced. Few weapons of war had left such a benign footprint. They had sheltered armies, rebuilt nations, educated students, and inspired engineers. And for those who remembered the stunned faces of their former enemies watching those first huts rise at Quonset Point, the legacy was personal. America's power had been measured once in tons of steel and gallons of fuel. Now it could be measured in something far greater, the ability to turn production into purpose. The story of the Quonset Hut did not end when the war did. It simply changed its mission, from surviving storms and bombs to surviving time itself. The story of the Quonset Hut is not simply about architecture, it is about the transformation of war into wisdom. In 1942, it began as a solution to a logistical problem: how to build shelter faster than the front could move. By 1945, it had become a blueprint for how a nation could mobilize intellect, machinery, and willpower into one synchronized force. For the German engineers who watched its rise, the Quonset was more than steel and rivets. It was a revelation of scale, a demonstration that true strength lies not in fortresses or firepower, but in systems that think ahead. And for America, it marked a turning point where production itself became a weapon, where innovation was measured in time saved and lives sheltered. Today, scattered across landscapes and memories, the surviving huts remain silent witnesses to that era. Rusted but enduring, they remind the world that progress, when guided by purpose, can outlive destruction. The curved roof of the Quonset Hut still speaks, not of conquest but of continuity, proof that humanity's greatest triumphs are built not on what it destroys, but on what it can rebuild.